glad you're here. This event is sponsored by the Humanities Program and the American Indian and Indigenous Studies Program. Much thanks goes to Reed Chapman, Renuka Gusain, Corey Anderson, Carolyn Ryden, Chris Asbill, and Kemp Thompson for their support in making this happen. And also thanks to our student techs today, Neo, Cielo, and Kayla. Okay, I'll let you guys get settled. We all come from many places to be at UNCA, and we acknowledge with respect the stolen ancestral homeland and the indigenous people who have been here since time immemorial. The land we are on is the ancestral land of the Anikituagi, more commonly known as the Cherokee. To the Anikituagi, this land is known as Togiadzi, where they race, and was part of the Cherokee Nation, Salagi Ayeli, which covered as many as 108,000 square miles of the American Southeast as late as 1730 and consisted of 60 or more towns. This act of recognition is not enough to overcome the settler colonial history that has attempted to eradicate indigenous people from the history and consciousness of these lands. It is a responsibility and work of humanities to move from these acknowledgments to action. As we know, humanities is not just history. Humanities shows us how history, philosophy, art, stories, and sciences from ancient times to today are woven together to give us our present shared reality. Today, humanities calls us to pay attention to the stories and voices that persist and resist, rooted in ancient traditions, reaching into the future. A relationship with Native communities that is rooted in relevancy, respect, and reciprocity requires making space to listen to contemporary Indigenous voices in and beyond the walls of the classroom, which has historically excluded these voices. We are honored and grateful to hear from our panelists today who will share stories, their work, and the issues that matter to them and their communities. As a gesture of appreciation, we have some gifts. Please accept these handmade gifts from our community to you.
Oh my gosh, thank you.
From our students and ourselves. There's going to be time for questions and answers after their presentations and their conversations. So as you listen, make note of the things that you'd like to talk with them about, because we're here to be in conversation. Let me introduce them, and then I'm going to hand it over to them. Byron Tenesaka. Born in an ancestral community in the Andes Mountain region of Ecuador to a family of basket weavers and agriculturalists, Byron Tenesaka's early years were spent learning the system of reciprocity that exists between humans and the mountains. At the age of 11, he was brought to the southeast part of the U.S. to meet and live with his biological mother. A certified K-12 art instructor, Byron received a Master's of Art in Teaching and Comprehensive Education from Western and is currently the art teacher at Johnston Elementary. Outside the classroom, he creates artworks in various media that document, layer, and weave memories, culture, and history from his Kishwa Kanuri heritage and that of the Appalachian Mountain region together. I apologize for any mispronunciations in this whole introduction. We also have Chanel Feather. As Education Program Manager, Chanel Feather oversees all educational programming and actively promotes and preserves Cherokee culture, language, song and dance, and community engagement. Chanel is a member of the Dene Nation and an Eastern Band Cherokee Indian enrolled member, originally from Wolftown Community in Cherokee, North Carolina. Chanel joined the Museum of Cherokee Indian team in January 2022 and is honored to be able to serve her community and tribal nation. Let's warmly welcome them.
Thank you. I have to bring this closer, I think. Yat Chanel Feather and Shit, hello, and Shio. Shio is Cherokee for hello. The language that I just introduced myself in was the Dene language, my mother's language, my matrilineal line. I always introduce myself that way first to honor my mother and all my foremothers, to make sure that I'm introducing myself in the proper way, the way that the Creator created me to speak. And so I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for the gifts, and thank you for the invitation. I'm honored and humbled to be sitting here, and thankful that you all are here, showed up. I know it's early, and ready to have your ears on, right? And listen, because that's, one of the things my dad always said. You have two ears and one mouth. You should listen twice as much as you talk. I don't know if I do that well, but I'm really, really thankful to be here.
Keep the presents coming. So, Yupai Chani, thank you. Nyuka, Vairon Tenesaka, Waman. I come from a Quechua community, Quechua being the language, and Cañari, the area where my family history and where majority of my family still lives today. And big thank you to the people who have put this together, and Shio, and to the other sister communities that might be also present here today in this space. And yeah, I'm super happy and thrilled to be here, and let's get this started.
Yeah. This is me. As I look back and see a huge photo of my little self. So one of the biggest reasons why I put this photo here to introduce me is because sometimes I forget that I was little at once, and it's always a good reminder, because I feel like a lot of the stereotypical understanding of Native American people is that we didn't grow up the same way that maybe everybody else does. Maybe we were wearing like war bonnets, and we had leather clothing that we wore every single day. And I know that's not, that imagery is changing. But I always like to start with that just as a reminder to myself that everyone, has to start somewhere. We always have to, crawl before we walk. And with this, journey of understanding, I really like the way that explanation of why humanities is a thing in universities is to help kind of broaden your understanding of your existence and everyone else's existence. And pardon me, I have allergies. I really get mad at myself that I have allergies, because I'm like, oh, you're Native. You should be one with the culture, but you're allergic with the environment, but you're allergic to it. So I always get mad at myself. Oh my gosh, these are so fast. This photo to the left right here, I took it about 3 years ago, and I visited my mom. And so I always talk about the matriarch, and why is that important to talk about? Well, in indigenous cultures, specifically in Cherokee and Navajo, we work on a clan system. And so whenever I introduced myself, I introduced my clan, and my mother's clan is how you get it through your mom, and that's totally opposite of what the United States has kind of built itself upon, modeling after the European patriarchy. I always talk about it's so ironic that people say my great great grandmother was a Cherokee princess, even though we didn't have princesses. That's totally European, and that construct is, and also that. Just that thinking is so patriarchal, to have titles like that, and we're only passed down, pretty much the leaders were only passed down to the oldest sons. That's totally not even indigenous at all. So that whole irony of just that statement, for me, is so problematic in so many ways. But whenever we talk about matriarchal societies and matrilineage, I always think about, obviously, I think about my mom. I think about my mom's mom, my grandma, Connie, who is pictured right here, this beautiful lady. So I'm in the middle, to the, I guess, my right, to your left. That's my mother's mom, Connie. And my mom is right above me. And then my mother's grandmother, maternally, is to the left of her, with the turquoise brooch, and that's my great grandmother Hedibot. So I'm in the center. My grandmother Connie is to the right of me. My mother's above me, and to the left of my mother is my grandmother Hedibot. That's as far as I can go back on that line, because my grandmother Hedibot, which I actually was able to meet in my lifetime, she was old. I was probably I was in the 8th grade whenever she passed away, and she passed away at 102. And she was like super super cool. Like, it was so weird whenever I remember meeting her, and going to the Hogan, and like just seeing how like old she was. It was almost as if like you're actually looking at the history books, whenever you open those black and white history books and you see like an old native person, and you're like, oh man, they look like, to me they look like rugged, and like they had like a hard life, and like just and wise at the same time. And so she's a desert person, so it was like all of these like just wisdom lines. And then she was a monolinguist, so she only spoke Navajo. And so I was never able to communicate with her because I don't speak the Diné language. But I remember we were sitting outside. This is funny. I'm telling the story right now. I didn't intend to tell this story, but we were sitting outside in this shed, and it's government housing, the house that they lived in. There's no water, no running water, outhouse. We call it sheep camp, where my grandma and my grandpa, my great grandparents lived. And sheep camp, they had sheeps. So we had a one, like 2, I guess, room home that the Navajo Nation, like tribal government, builds for people if they have enough land. And then we had also a hogan, which is a round mud adobe type home that Diné people live in, and it's just one room. But my grandparents had this other house, and then there was like a little woodshed in the front. And she was sitting there, and I went and sat with her, and I was like probably like 9 at that time, and she was talking to me, and I couldn't understand a word. I was like, I don't know what you're saying. And she kept pointing at this gallon bottle. It was like a gallon, like a milk gallon. It looked like that, but it had a Sunkist label on it. And she kept pointing at it like, I was like, oh, do you want me to open this? And I was like, oh, okay, I'll open it. And I opened it for her, and then she drank some of it. And then we're sitting there, and she's still talking to me. And my grandmother my grandma Connie, she comes out of the house, like checking on us or whatever. And she sees us, and we're sitting there, and she's like, she starts speaking in Navajo. She's like, Chindi, Chindi. Those are not good words, so don't say them. And she's like, what are you doing? What's going on? And then she's like, what is this? And she's like, that's motor oil. And she's like, did she drink that? And I was like, yeah. And she's like, that's motor oil. That's not Sunkist, like the label said. And I was like, she's like, my aunts were like freaking out. And I was later on, as I got older, I joked she was just trying to get her motor started. But we had to call the medicine man and have a whole ceremony. Which I had no understanding of like what that was like going on around me, but it was like immediate. And I just remember staying up all night that next day to try to, remedy. She didn't. I don't think that she got sick. As from my memory, she was fine. She wasn't like sick. We didn't have to rush her to the hospital. And if we had, the hospital was so far away from where Sheep Camp was. And my aunt Dolly still lives. My great aunt Dolly still lives there now. And they do have sheep. My great grandparents were sheep herders, and my great grandmother was a really good rug maker, a rug weaver. And that's where my grandmother learned how to weave rugs. So I have a collection of rugs, which actually I have one in the back of my car, and I should have like totally brought to show. And it's a double weave rug made out of wool. And so they would do that. And oh wow, this is a picture of my sisters and I. So I have two sisters, and I really love this picture because it really depicts to me kind of like the passing on of knowledge, and not through our hair like with Avatar, but like really just how you with indigenous communities with knowledge like that, sharing of histories or stories is really how that knowledge is passed down. And whenever we think about like I've really tried to decolonize my terminology with talking about stories, and really trying to educate people that these aren't just stories. These stories are real. They're a part of our DNA. They're our origin. And a lot of people in the South really, I'll use Genesis. This is our Genesis. And a lot of communities that I kind of educate with at the museum, some people will be like, whoa, you're using like biblical terms. But sometimes that's the only way to really understand and relate to kind of like me in the way that I try to, instruct and teach that it's not just a story. These aren't made up fables. These aren't tall tales or fabrications or exaggerations. These are actually histories that were passed down orally. And whenever we think about it in that way, it really places us as an indigenous community where we are, and as opposed to displacing. I think we've combated that displacement all of our lives. We've tried to make sure that we are telling our true stories in an accurate way from our own voices. And that means that we have an origin. That means we have been here for since the beginning. My origin story, my history, it's told through first man, first woman, Shelu Kanadi. It's told through our first fire stories. We are the Anigadua, Aniyoia, the people of the fire, and how we got that fire. That ladybug, water beetle, brought that fire to us, and we were instructed how to take care of our relatives with that fire and what those fires are. And ancestral indigenous knowledge is of key importance of our survival in so many aspects of what we do here. And so these are all of my two grandmas on either side of me. So my paternal grandmother is in the like leather outfit. And it really, I chose this photo because it speaks to kind of a survival, a way of survival to Cherokee, Eastern Band Cherokee people in the 70s, in the 60s and 70s. And our economical growth, we're actually, we're ahead in so many ways, but we're also behind in so many other ways. And whenever we talk about like not having running water with the Navajo people and this home right here, I want to kind of get back to that. As I was growing up, in Cherokee, North Carolina, with water flowing down, down the middle of town, and I would sleep, and where I grew up, I could hear a waterfall, and every night, and I could hear like life, like those katydids and those cicadas that are so loud, and I would get so annoyed, and I'd get so mad, and I'd put a pillow over my ears at night, and thinking like, man, I hate it's so loud. Just shut up. I want to go to sleep. And it's so dark here. And sometimes you could hear like bears. I remember one night, all I could think of was like little black bears and maybe like a mama bear. And I could hear like scratching on like my house. And I lived on this, the top story. But I could hear these life. You can always hear life in these mountains. And so the waterfall, the bears, the cicadas, all of that was so loud for me. I went to college in Chicago, and whenever I left here for the first time, and it was so quiet. All you could hear was like the highway that was by my university, and I just remember missing those sounds. I remember missing the sound of that waterfall, the sound of those cicadas, the sound of maybe that black bear family that was scratching on the house. But we're so fortunate, all that to say that we're so fortunate. Eastern Band Cherokee people are so fortunate that there's so much life always existing around. And that's, because of, where we live, our region. Our deciduous rainforest has life that hasn't even been discovered or named yet by the scientists. But indigenous people know all of their names. And have a name for them. They're just dormant right now. And so the depiction of this picture, my mom would always say, you guys need to be thankful. Be thankful for what you have, even though, we didn't have a lot. My parents were young parents. We lived in our tribal home that is not the best home. When you think about like impoverished, like ghetto communities or inner city, low income housing, that's pretty much the community that I lived in. The people that I rode the bus with were my neighbors, and some of them were my relatives, but a lot of them were dealing with a lot of trauma. And a lot of them, even like as the story goes, I'm 38, and I've seen some of their stories live out, and they're not always the most happy, stories. And so my mom would always say, be thankful that you have what you have. And I didn't realize until about 3 years ago, because my mom would say, how your parents are, like, oh, we used to walk in the snow barefoot to get to school. At least you have a bus to ride in, a warm bus. It always feels so extreme. My mom would say, I didn't have any of that growing up. I didn't have that. And you should see my house that I grew up in. Well, this is my mom's house that she grew up in. And I didn't put that together until about 3 years ago, whenever I actually seen my mom's house. And then all of those things started like coming back to me, those memories where it was like, be thankful. Be thankful that you have what you have, and that you have two parents that are here and in the home and getting their education. Both my parents, my mother is a master's of social work. My father has his bachelor's in communications. And I lived through that, them going to school and getting that my mom went back to school when I was 5, and she graduated summa cum laude when I was in the 8th grade. and I had no other option but to go to college. And where a lot of my friends, my classmates, didn't have an expectation. And they were either, if they were going to graduate high school, they might be the first in their families to do that. But my expectation was higher. And one of those, and there's a reason for all of these things. My mother went to, she's a boarding school survivor. So she went to Tohatchee boarding school in Arizona and that was a Catholic boarding school. There's a lot of abuses that was happening there. She went when she was about 6 years old, and spent her elementary time there. And wow, this 2 weeks ago, my youngest sister, she's not up there anymore. She had a baby, so the first grandbaby. And so my mom was visiting because my parents are no longer together. So my mom was just left yesterday to go back to Utah, where she lives, and but it wasn't until last Sunday my mom started talking about her time in boarding school, and she never talked about it when we were growing up. And it wasn't until I was about 24 or 25, my mom had coerced me to go to a women's leadership symposium, a conference that was happening, Indigenous women leadership that was happening in Cherokee. And I was just so happened to like have some time before going back to school, and basketball practice, and going, because I went to school at Montreat for a couple of years. And I went to this symposium, and I remember a speaker who was speaking. She was the first like prime minister of a Canadian First Nations tribe, and I can't remember her name, but she started talking about the experience of boarding school and how the experience for her tribe was they would fly in on planes and they would just take these kids and take them to a school and take them to this building. And once they got them there, they would take them and basically strip them of all of their clothing and and bathe them with sometimes with like gasoline in their hair, because all Indigenous people have like bugs, I guess, parasites in their hair or on their bodies. So they would douse them in gasoline or this powder lye soap. And then they would cut their hair and they would give them a new name and they would give them new clothes and then make them speak, English. They couldn't speak their language, and there was so much abuse. And this lady was just talking about the 70s. And I remember, as I'm sitting there listening, and I'm just like very convicted, because I was so like, man, I didn't have to go through that, thankfully. But I had this like my mom right here, and I'm like, as I'm like listening to her, and I look over at my mom, and my mom is starting to cry. And at that moment, that's when I realized all of these this history that this woman was sharing was the same history that my mom had, and but was never able to like speak about it. And she shared. So my mom shared some histories this past weekend with me and a group of my relatives. And this was the first time. So my mom was holding my nephew. Fast forward to today, my mom was holding my nephew, and her hair was just like in the way. And she said, "Hey Chanel, can you pull my hair back?" And I said, "Oh yeah." I said, "Yeah." I said, "Do you want me to braid it?" And my mom said, "Yeah." And I said, "Okay." So I pulled my mom's hair back, and I braided her hair just really, just a braid, like a loose braid, not like something tight, in the back. And it didn't dawn on me, so I just like did that because I braid people's hair often. And about 5 days later, when we were sitting in that house with my relatives, and my mom started talking, and she said, I never let anybody touch my hair. Because when I was in boarding school, I used to have to wake up, and I was a little kid, and they'd make us go to the big girls' side of the dorms, and they would braid their hair, and they would braid their hair so tight that it gave them some headaches, and their eyes would be like this, and she could not move. If she were to move, they would smack her on her head and say, "Don't move," really hard. And this was a regular thing that she would have to do. And my mom, in that moment, just last week, she said, I never let anybody braid my hair. This is the first time that I let, and it was Chanel, I let braid my hair. And it was because, and that triggered my mom, that memory. And I didn't realize how significant that was, and that moment was. And it was like, almost like a acknowledgement of healing in a way, and a new beginning. And it was in my head in that moment. That's what I kind of heard. My mom, without saying so much, had acknowledged that, and that holding, my new nephew, who's only like 6 days old at that time, and then allowing me to also braid her hair was so powerful of an action, and such a healing moment, and a transference of and just power in a way. So I didn't make that connection until like today in this moment. So I'm like, don't want to like cry, but feeling that way a little bit. So when we talk about like all of those things, I really think that I actually just last week went to a conference, first of its kind, and it was held in Cherokee, and it was about intergenerational trauma and how that shows up in the workplace. And that conversation is being started in our community more and more, and not in a way that's traumatic, but in a way that's healing, in a way that's hopefully triggering healing, to allow other people to have these realizations and to meet people where they are, as opposed to bringing our biases and thinking about these, I guess, patriarchal understandings of life that are always floating around us at all times in America. Those understandings and teachings, we're really starting to look through those, that black and white, and start seeing those different shades of grays, to really understand and heal in a good way, and really reconnect with the place that we are at, and then connecting with each other in a place that each one of us are at. So yeah, I think I want to leave it there. I don't know how much time. I've meant to put a little a timer on me because I can talk, and I will talk. I get it from my dad. My dad's an MC, has been all my life. And when the bright lights come on and the microphone's given to me, I know what to do. So I don't know, Byron,
Yeah.
I passed the baton.
All right. UNCA students, hey. If you're a student, I want to do two things before I get started. I'm going to pass my basket around. My family weaves baskets for a living, and to this day in Ecuador, they're selling baskets, and sometimes I sell baskets here. But in Ecuador, when somebody approaches you, they're mainly for the purpose of using it to store something. So they'll come to you and they'll grab the basket, and whoever's gonna buy it will squeeze it, look at it, flip it, do this, and then like, how much is it? And then we do a little thing. But while that's happening, the person or my aunties probably, they go ahead and tell you about how the basket was woven and what are some of the usages that you can do and whatever. So I'm gonna pass this basket around. It's one of my artworks I made as of late, and it's a prototype. And it also got rained on the other day. But feel free to squeeze it, look at it, pass it along. So while I present, I'll do my little presentation. Hopefully, everybody has been able to touch it, and I'll be done by then. And then another thing, if you are a student here, if you can please close your eyes for a second, and think about that motherly role figure in your life, whether it be your auntie, your sister, someone who has helped you get here and who has watered your life at your early stage when you were a youth, right? That person who has given a little bit of them, their energy, so that you can make it where you're at today. Whether it be your sister, your auntie, I don't know. For me, it was my grandma, and she watered my roots with a lot of knowledge, with a lot of awesome things at an early age that because of immigration, it kind of stopped for a little while. But as an adult, again, watering my roots and expanding those roots that my grandma was able to nourish at an early stage. So, all right, let me start my presentation, and I'll go ahead and pass this basket. Start over here. Let's keep going. All right, so I nurture it, and it nourishes me. I become the mountain, and the mountain becomes me. So I grew up very high in the Andes in a community, and we plant our crops in the mountain, and so in a way, eventually we're eating the mountain, and so a part of the mountain is within us throughout our life, and then at the end of our life, we again become part of the mountain when we die. Okay, so that quote, I wanted to start with that right there. And let's get going. And they already introduced me. I'm an educator. I'm an artist. So I'm going to be touching on those two pieces today and telling you a little bit about my family. This is my grandma. Her name is Maria Francisca Guaman Morocho. And my grandma, she, for her whole life, is a basket weaver. And growing up with her, because my biological mother, had immigrated when I was a year old. And growing up with my aunties, one of them has a mental disability and the other one has a physical disability. And so they were around. Obviously, my grandma had to take care of them, and my other aunties would sometimes join, and we would just sit around in a circle and weave in community and also reflect on the things that maybe in our family we needed to talk about and things like that. And so in our Andean way of living, our cosmovision, we place nature and other beings at the center of it, and how we can live in harmony in the system of reciprocity, right? Where you not only take, but also give something up of yourself, whether it be energy, whether it be time, effort, something in order to exchange this energy. And so we call this Ayu, and the process of reciprocity, Aini. And so when I came to the U.S. As an immigrant, instantly in the public school system, what was done was assimilation, right? With a lot of immigrant students. Me coming from an indigenous community where we also speak Spanish as our first language. My great-grandma, her first language was Quechua, and then over the years, with education that came into our community, that also came some of the erasure of our language. And so I got here to the U.S. at the age of 11, and then the process of assimilation, that you need to learn English, that you need to do this, you need to do that, into mainstream U.S. culture. But when I went to WCU here in the mountains, I started learning more about the eastern band of the Cherokees, and I made some friends, and the mountains, just the Cherokee Mountains, started healing me. But when I graduated from WCU, I graduated with a degree in painting, in studio art, and I was same like maybe some of you at this age, just exploring the whys, like why am I doing this? Where am I going? Where are you headed? A lot of questions of why, trying to make your understanding of yourself and being okay with it. How are you going to move on from this point forward? You don't have your parents anymore, right? Some of you have moved on, or maybe you might go back to living with your parents, but from now on, how are you going to move forward, right? And so those questions were going through my mind a lot, and just learning in school about art, and from a very Eurocentric perspective, visual art, and that's where I was at the time when I created these pieces. Keep going. And so at the very end, I also started photographing and dove really into photography at the very end. And after graduating from WCU, and then I started meeting with people, talking to them, trying to understand their realities, how they see the world. And so throughout Western North Carolina, there's a lot of folks here with a lot of very unique ways of dressing and thinking, and I wanted to talk to them. I wanted to see how they view the world, right? Because how you see the world, somebody else is different. And same when I travel back to my country, same when I travel back to my country, I would often chase those images that I saw growing up as a youth, hanging from my grandmother's skirt. My grandmother's my mother, so I'm gonna call her mother throughout this presentation. So hanging from my mother's skirt, chasing these images from my youth through my documentary photography. Keep going. And then I got a residency at the Bascom in Highlands, North Carolina. And in there, I was exploring more of digital collage and photo montage, and again, touching on those questions of like, how am I going to move forward with myself, and how I view myself, and maybe some little downfalls in terms of my level of energy and how I identified. And I started doing a series of portraits on myself and my image, because I've always taken photographs up to this point of people, but never of myself. And so reflecting on myself, not only internally how I think, but also physically, right? And then the more that I expended my time on nature and outside in the mountains, fishing and hiking, and doing some documentary photography, and I started experimenting with the self, and a lot of the images, pause right there, and a lot of the images that I started creating, I was wondering where are all these images or all these things coming from my unconscious thinking. And so I started thinking back at my early stages before I immigrated to the U.S. about being a youth, and my grandma warming the water in a big pot so that during the cold season, so that I could bathe. This is my nephew. And just chasing those images every time I saw something that kind of made me relieve my youth, I went back and touched on that as well. And so I started also thinking about my auntie with this bone disease, and she's not able to walk straight. I remember my grandma also bathing her, warming the water, and as a youth, you view things, and so I would view her back. It was so round, and so I'm like, man, this is maybe where this type of imagery is coming from, right? And then for you as well, when you're in your mom's womb, right, you're in that position where it's very round, like a seed or a pod or a fruit, very organic. And so I started thinking about her and how we would grow up together. And so I expanded on that image, and also some other artists that influenced me. For example, at the time where Robert Mapplethorpe, I think his name is, and how he created a series of photographs around the human body of the male human body. And so I took this seed or this pod or this fruit, and I wanted to capture at the time how we as individuals, as our materialistic, organic self, we have the ability to grow from a seed and then bloom, right? Bloom, reproduce, and then also grow old and decay, and then go back to being part of the earth again and, serve as a fertilizer. You have that ability, right? And so I wanted to capture that. And these images that I have of growing up around our community, and we grew up a lot of squashes, and often the squashes would be laying out on our fields, just there, sometimes drying. And so I wanted to put this human form. It's called Human Mounds, the title of this series, and I wanted to put them in a lot of different places that I would often go to write about or draw. And and I kept, and then I took that concept and applied it to some other different types of weathers, like snow here. And then I started taking it with me wherever I went to the mountains. This is at Max Patch, my first time there. Beautiful place to be. This one, I remember I wanted to make a nest because when living in Ecuador, I would collect nests. We didn't really have the plastic toys. My toys were like certain types of rocks that I would collect, nests that I would collect from leftover from the birdies. And so I remember my grandma saying one day, "Hey, you're gonna go live with your real mom," she said. And I was like, "My real mom?" And I started thinking more about that. And when the day finally came, she said, "Okay, you have to get some of your belongings because you're gonna go far away to live with your real mom." And so I was like, "Oh man!" I was like, "All right, let me grab some items." And so I started collecting all of my sticks and my little things. And she was like, "No." She was like, "What are you doing?" She was like, "Where you're going, you're gonna have real toys." And I was like those in TV? And she was like, "Yeah." And so I left. I remember leaving some of my things. The only thing that I remember I had won in the game were marbles. I had a huge collection of marbles. I don't even know what happened to those, but I remember leaving my nest. And that ability as humans, that at some point in your life, right, as well, that you're going to be creating your nests in your community, right? Whether you're a parent, whether you're a member of your community, how you serve your community, you're going to be weaving those things with other community members to create a space for comfort, for healing, to be at a state where you feel safe, right? And so I made this nest a whole day in the middle of highlands around there, in the middle of nowhere, a whole day just creating this nest to make this photograph, yeah. And then I took, again, this to other places I went, took it to the beach. And then right around that time, I started traveling back to Ecuador a little more often. And in my community, again, chasing those images of my youth, where we would go in. One of my chores was to sometimes go see the animals with my sister, and often go cut grass for the guinea pigs, because we would have guinea pigs and we would eat them. And so one of my jobs was to go and get grass for the guinea pigs. And this is my cousin and I getting the grass. And I love taking little memories like that and leaving some aspect to it, but also presenting in a very almost surrealistic way. This is right beside our adobe house. As Chanel mentioned, our houses are also made from adobe. We call it adobe. Mm-hmm. This is one of our my great grandma. This is her land that she got through the land reform when the country started giving back some of the land to indigenous people. And this is where we harvest. You can see a lot of the leaves at the front. Those are squash leaves. And that's my auntie and my cousin, her daughter. One of my cousins, she's washing the garlic here and preparing it to take it to the market. This is one of the ways she's able to pay for her college. And going back to my grandma now that she lives here in North Carolina, she worked in the field and agriculture and also weaving baskets. And so when you shake her hand, I often say it's like a paw. You're shaking a heavy, heavy paw. And I mean, you can see her forearm, just so strong woman from weaving these baskets. And so I wanted to think about, again, where I was heading with this and the type of artwork that I was making and how I'm going to move on forward as an educator, as a leader, and reflecting a lot on that. And so with all of that, I started, I wanted to think about the person who had watered my roots at the early stage in my life, right? That has allowed me to flourish later in my life and sort of come at peace with my immigration journey, with a lot of trauma in my life. And so I wanted to go back and explore more of that, have more conversations with my grandma, record some of her oral stories, and document her life now that she's here, and what does it mean to be here in a space where she's not able to fully practice her indigenous ways of living. And so this is her getting ready to go to church. This is her at work. I'm picking her from work. She was briefly working. She retired recently, but she was briefly working, making boxes for this packing company. This is her after showering. She's combing her hair, and the other one, she's getting mail. And this is right after she had knee surgery. And so the other one, I said, Grandma, Mom, I said, can you stay right there? Because I love this light. And she was cold, and she was like, how long? Her face is like, how long do I have to stay here for? And it was, all of these were shot in film, so it made it a little extra special. And my grandma practiced a lot of syncretism, which is like our indigenous traditions mixed with Catholicism together. And a lot of our community, we also practice a lot of that. And so I wanted to explore more on that and go back to that early stage of my life. And I started documenting things that would make me happy as a youth, and that would just images and things that would make me happy as a youth. For example, squash, going into the fields and looking for the squash that you have to harvest it at 3 stages in their life. At the early stage, you can make a yummy soup with it. And so it was like going, the equivalent that I've seen here is like those Easter eggs that some people make, like going and finding those. It was so fun as a youth going to find these squashes to sell them in the market. And then also interacting with the nature, realizing, at an early age, like seeing a dead animal. And so I started sort of focusing more on our crops. And so this is an artwork that I made inspired by maize. And this, again, the system of reciprocity. I have the maize kernel. And then beside it is a person mimicking the lines of the kernel. And so in a way, me presenting somewhat like a harmony in how humans and our indigenous communities, our history with this crop, and again, how we put a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of energy into a crop, and in return, that crop is able to return that to us in food, right? So, and then this one, it's inspired by a starchy potato. There's so many different types of potatoes, by the way, over 1,000 if you go to South America. This is just one of them. It's called oca, and this is the flower, that's the leaf, and again, I put it, presence of the human in a very organic, using organic lines in that position to, again, focus on that reciprocity system that we have. This one is about zapallo, which is the type of squash that grows everywhere in my community, and how till this day, we still harvest it, and we use almost all of it, the meat, the seeds, even the flower in some indigenous communities as well in Central America. This is papachola, we call it. Papachola because of the red, because high in the Andes, because of the sun and the cold, how it gets cold in the morning at night. A lot of in our communities, our cheeks are red right here. And so papachola, it's like a reference to that, to our cheeks, how they get red sometimes when it's very cold and then the sun kind of burns our skin. And so with all of that, I also, again, going back to my early stages of my life and how my family and my family's history of weaving over 4 generations that we have in record of basket weavers, I encounter weaving here in the Cherokee Mountains. And this is my one of the Cherokee baskets that I have, and I love the design. This is I started to investigate a little, and I believe this is called an arrowhead design. And so the one on the left, Cherokee basket, is a tiny basket, beautiful, beautiful basket. And so I started to think more about like how in our community we don't really pay attention so much about like the designs. We mainly pay attention to the functionality. And so the one on the right, your right, is a basket woven by my auntie. And the most beautiful thing I love about that basket is the rim part, and how it's very intricate. And I remember learning how to weave early, but I never actually learned how to do the rim. And so over the pandemic, I remember doing a series of studies on the rim, and I had to FaceTime my auntie, and she was like, okay, this is how you do it. And, you know, me being an educator, I was expecting, I guess, in my mind for her to be like, okay, hold your right hand and your pointing finger and your, you know, and do this, do that, step by step. And she was just like, this is how you do it. And she started doing it in front of the camera. And I was like, wait. I was like, auntie, but tell me, like, where is, like, and she was like, no, just look. And so part of my education where, you know, there European-centric education, there's so many steps and so many planning. And in our indigenous communities, you just are there looking.
Watch and learn.
Watching, right, from a youth. And so I was like, you know, it's not, I shouldn't be frustrated with her. It's just that it's just different. It's just different. And so then I had to watch a lot of her and how she did it from different angles for me to start experimenting with it. And so I merged these 2 ideas in some of my artwork, my drawings and my photographs, and being inspired as well by the artwork of Sean Goshorn, an artist who does basketry, and with paper. And so, I started talking more to my grandma about our generations, about the 4 generations of basket weavers in my family, starting with myself and my mother, my grandma, and her mother, and how there was a lot of aunties, and it's just mainly the female presence in my family, and how basket weaving has allowed us to, you know, to keep fighting and being alive and a source of income. And so I wanted to highlight and commemorate that through my art. And so I did portraits of a portrait of my family. This is a portrait of all of my family, and at different times of the day, and how our schedule would go with the sun, and how we would do different things. So it's morning, midday, sunset, and then at night. And so I took this, and along with some of the items that would be stored in the basket, main items like potato, maize, beans, and squash, and I wove a basket inspired by Sean Goshorn. And I used the arrowhead design that I really love so much about this Cherokee basket that inspired me. And, you know, I also wanted to honor that this basket was woven here in the Cherokee Mountains, and also honor my aunties and our history of basket weavers by doing the rim just like them. And put the portrait at the bottom, because the base of the basket is the most important part of the basket, and the base will tell you how the basket is going to take form in a way. And so to me, my aunties, my grandma, and our elders very important. So I put them at the bottom of the basket. And I remember being in my apartment, and the first one, it was like a days long of just trial and effort. The second one was 9 hours, and the third one was 6 hours, and so on. And I'm able to weave one now in 3 hours. And yeah, this is 12 baskets representing the 4 generations of basket weavers in my family. And again, watering those roots, expanding those roots, and everybody, and you know, this as a student, you are here present with your own roots, and how are you going to water those roots and become a leader? And someday, like I always tell people, as my grandma and other elders tell me, you have that responsibility of passing that knowledge, passing whatever you have within you to the next generation, whether it be to your nieces, nephews, or your son, your daughter, to your neighbor, directly or indirectly, through laws in food, through laws in transportation, anything. So think about that as you go to your future in your own careers. How are you going to water those roots for the next generation, right? And that's how my grandma watered my roots so that I can be here with you today.
There were so many ways that what both of you said just kind of wove together as well. So now we have time for questions. Maybe the two of you have questions for each other, and some of y'all have questions for them. There's a mic right there. You can stand and go to ask questions of our panelists and hear them in conversation.
I also wanted to mention that I have two of my team leaders at the museum here, Nola and Jarrett, and they did a oral history lesson a couple weeks ago here. Maybe some of you all participated in it. It's called Words Carry On. And they're in the community. They've been here. They are also oral historians, and they share our Genesis stories and all the other amazing oral histories that we have continued to preserve. So they are here. You can ask them questions as well. I'll offer them as tributes. I'm just kidding. Any questions?
Preguntas.
I just wanted to say I loved all of that, and how beautiful this right here is, and just the imagery of, us as plants makes so much sense, and us as seeds, and how just that made me really think about, where, all of the places that I've gone and traveled and have, imprinted, living in Chicago, living at Montreat, I was a nanny a little bit in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And, my mother has roots in, the Southwest. All of those things, like, wherever you have been planted, you have been watered as well by either that environment or those, matriarchal archetypes that, may not be your actual, mothers or, but, the encounter grows you and waters you in a sense. To then, for me, like now I'm creating this nest in Cherokee back home after I've experienced all of these waterings, and am planting, some roots for myself, to be able to bring all of those encounters and those experiences back, in order to help, water others, is such a cool way of explaining, Chanel Feather Education Program Manager. It's really, really cool for me to think as, to be able to relate to that in so many ways. And just the fact that you're like weaving Byron and I's presentation wove so well together. It's because of him. He's the weaver here. So I honor that and I appreciate that that knowledge that you just passed to us. You watered us.
Thank you.
Oh yes.
What's your earliest memory of being in a relationship with your mother or your grandmother, or just from the lineage of your mother? What's the earliest memory?
I actually remember, like, I think my earliest memory would have to be in a sweat lodge, honestly. And funnily enough, the sweat lodge that my family would go to when I have a sister that's a year and a half younger than me. And so we grew up together. And then my youngest sister is 13 years younger than me. So she had a totally different life. And so whenever I was young, we would go to actually Nola's great grandmother's house, and she had a sweat lodge in Cherokee. And it was one of my family and her great grandmother, and that side of her family, they also have sweat lodges. And I can remember being in a sweat lodge with my mother and my sister and all of these women in this lodge, praying and just existing in this womb space, warm space as well, together. And I always have like that experience and imagery in my mind when I think about like my earliest memory and that connection with not only the earth, the Mother Earth underneath, because you're sitting on dirt, and then the fire from the warmth from the stones, and the water that is thrown on the stones. And then also just being around these women in this safe space. That's one of my happy places. Even though now as I get older, when I go to a sweat lodge, I'm like, oh my gosh, anxiety filled and feeling claustrophobic. And I have to like work through that through lots of prayer. But that's definitely an image that I call upon for strength sometimes.
For me, it's growing up in the mountains. I remember one time falling down a hill, and the thorny plant caught me by my clothes. I used to wear my sister's clothes, and my grandma would make clothes for me for my sister. And I remember falling and getting caught, like, and she was so worried. She was like, "Oh my God, I about lost you." She was like, "Definitely not telling this to your mom." And so a lot of things like that, just funny stories here and there. I remember one time with bathing, she would like warm water. It was a lot of time of an effort of her to heat up the water and bathe me. And one time I remember it was like half a day she took for me and my sister. And I was all clean, fresh clothes and everything. And then I went outside and I was playing with my kite that I had made. And it was kite season, very windy season. And then I was looking at the kite. I ended up falling in a muddy ditch, like just completely covered with mud, black, just completely, like stinky mud. That's the mud that's been sitting there for a while. And I remember I was like, oh my gosh. And I remember the bus. There was one bus that came through our village, and the bus was coming full with people. And my grandma, or somebody was in there. We were expecting someone, and so I go back and jump back in the in the mud and just like hide because like I was like I'm so embarrassed. And then I get out and I go back in my house and I'm like Mom, and she's like, oh my gosh. She grabs me and straight to the faucet, just cold water. It's cold in the Andes. Just hose me down, and I was crying. But that, and I mean, a lot of other things that I guess growing up as a boy, just getting into a lot of things. And I remember like she would always, when I was up to no good or not staying late, she was like, okay, when it starts to sunset, you need to be in the house. I'll be playing with my friends. And sure enough, she would always like carefully start working towards me like around the corner with her hand behind her back because she had a little stick, a little branch. She was like, you need to get in the house now. A lot of things like that. Just funny stories that we often talk about and share, and it's just laugh about now looking back at it, I guess. Yeah.
We at UNCA, we have a land acknowledgement. You heard it at the beginning of this lecture. We say it, it's presented to us at the beginning of some of these lectures. We also have it. They're working on construction-wise. They're working on the front of the library right now. But usually it's one of 4 banners that we have hanging from the library as well. And I know that the theater department also sort of delivers it before all of their performances. I was wondering how you, as Indigenous people, feel about that. If there's anything that you feel positively or negatively about that.
Good question. So we've actually had this discussion a lot at the museum, and I guess the takeaway from it is, what are you doing to throughout the year, not just for those events or for whatever. Like, it's cool to have a land acknowledgement, right? But as the understanding the meaning behind it, why it's there, why is it significant, but then also the action behind. It's not just words. I think, sometimes those things can fall on deaf ears. But the fact that, this is my second time here, the fact that, my team has been here twice, all of these events that are being held at UNCA, all of the faculty that reach out to me on a regular basis, that relationship that's being cultivated whenever they, you all come to Cherokee, and we're, able to take you through the museum, take you to our mountain sites, take you to, the river, and have these oral history lessons. It's actively, there's action followed behind that acknowledgement. So I appreciate that. I respect that. And it's not just something that's a banner that's, hung up. There's actually actions that are actively being worked on regularly, and it's in the psyche of UNCA, and it's in the framework. So it's not just something that you say or it's recited without any meaning behind it. That's what I love about it. And I'm a little bit of an insider because I get to help facilitate that. And so I know that. So I always say that, UNCA does a really amazing job of supporting it. And it's not just words. There aren't a lot of universities that are doing that. And I'll tell you, from my frame of work, UNCA is the most active and the best and most supportive college that I work with, university that I work with. So that's really cool.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I want to just acknowledge that it's 12:15, and I know some of us have to go. We can stay a little bit longer and talk. And also, Chanel and Byron are both going to be part of this Activating Indigenous Beats Festival a couple of weeks from now. So you can reconnect with them there, too. Let's give them a hand as we leave. Those of you with questions, if you want to come down and continue conversation, you can do that for a little bit.
No, I was just gonna say, walk it like you talk it, like she said.